The Galactic Concord had been watching Earth for a very long time. Their survey drones had first arrived in the Sol system 3,000 years ago, back when humans were still building pyramids and arguing about which gods controlled the rain. The drones had recorded everything. They watched humans discover fire, then use it to burn each other's villages. They watched humans invent the wheel, then attach blades to it and roll it through enemy camps. They watched humans develop writing, then use it to record better ways of killing. The Concord's behavioral scientists found it all very concerning. Ambassador had read every report on the human species. She was a being of flowing silver light contained within a crystalline shell, and she had spent 400 years studying primitive civilizations. Humans were not the most violent species she had ever observed. They were not even the most creative in their violence, but they were something far more troubling. They were adaptable. Most species found a way of fighting and stuck with it. They had their acid spitters, they had their psychic assaults, they had their overwhelming numbers, but humans kept changing. They went from stones to bronze to iron to steel. They went from arrows to bullets to bombs. They never stopped improving, never stopped experimenting, never stopped finding new ways to hurt each other. And that was the problem, because a species that could not stop improving its weapons would eventually improve them enough to reach the stars. And when they did, the Galactic Concord would have to deal with them. The solution came from the Council of Elders, the oldest in beings in the known galaxy. They proposed something that had been done only twice before in galactic history: a quarantine, a complete isolation of the Sol system. No contact, no technology, no hint that humanity was not alone in the universe. They would build a wall of automated defense platforms around the heliosphere, and they would wait. Either the humans would mature and learn to live in peace with themselves, or they would destroy themselves with their own weapons. Either way, the galaxy would be safe. Had voted in favor of the quarantine. She still believed it was the right decision. But that was 200 years ago, and things had changed in ways that no one had predicted. The first problem was the mining consortium. The corporation was one of the largest industrial operations in the galaxy, and they produced enormous amounts of waste. Toxic materials, broken machinery, depleted fuel cells, damaged hull plating. All of it had to go somewhere, and proper disposal was expensive. Someone in the corporation's leadership had looked at the quarantined Sol system and seen an opportunity. The humans could not reach the outer edges of their system. Their primitive chemical rockets could barely get them to their own moon. So what harm could come from dumping waste in the space around Neptune and Uranus? The quarantined satellites would keep the humans contained, and the corporation would save billions of credits in disposal fees. Had protested when she learned about it. She had filed formal complaints with the Oversight Committee. She had warned that the humans were more resourceful than anyone gave them credit for, but her protests were ignored. The corporation had powerful friends on the council, and the profits were too good to pass up. For 50 years, the dumping continued. Cargo ships arrived every month, dropping their loads of broken technology into the darkness beyond Neptune. Mountains of alien garbage accumulated in the cold void, drifting slowly through the outer system. And the quarantined satellites kept watch, their sensors pointed inward, looking for any sign that the humans were trying to escape. They should have been looking outward instead. The humans had noticed the garbage. Of course they had. Their telescopes had grown stronger over the centuries, and their curiosity had never diminished. They saw the cargo ships arriving. They saw the debris fields growing. They could not understand what they were seeing, but they knew it was not natural. Something was out there, something intelligent, something that was treating their solar system like a dumping ground. The first human expedition to the outer system launched in 2247. It was a small ship, barely more than a tin can with an engine strapped to it. The crew of 6 knew they would probably not survive the journey. The quarantined satellites detected them almost immediately and moved to intercept. But the humans had learned something important from watching the cargo ships. They had learned the patrol patterns. They had learned the gaps in coverage. They had learned that the satellites were designed to stop ships trying to leave the system, not ships trying to reach the debris fields. The expedition made it to the garbage. They spent 3 weeks collecting samples before their supplies ran out and they had to turn back. 4 of the 6 crew members died on the return journey, but the 2 survivors brought something back with them. They brought pieces of alien technology. The scientists on Earth had no idea what they were looking at. The materials were unlike anything they had ever seen. The engineering principles were completely foreign, but humans had spent their entire history figuring out how things worked, and they were not about to stop now. It took them 20 years to understand the first piece of debris. It was a broken power coupling from a cargo hauler, and it contained a type of superconducting material that should not have been possible according to human physics. Within 5 years, human engineers had figured out how to manufacture it themselves. Within 10 years, they had used it to build better engines. The quarantine satellites detected the new ships and moved to intercept them as well. But the humans had learned from their first expedition. They sent decoys. They sent jammers. They sent ships that were designed to be caught, ships that carried no crew but plenty of explosives. The satellites destroyed dozens of human vessels, but dozens more got through. Each expedition brought back more debris, more materials, more secrets. Received the first warning reports 30 years ago. Human technology was advancing faster than predicted. Their ships were getting stronger, faster, more capable. They had reverse-engineered alien alloys and alien fuels and alien navigation systems. They were still primitive by galactic standards, but they were improving at an alarming rate. She requested an emergency session of the Oversight Committee. She demanded that the dumping be stopped immediately. She warned that the humans were learning, adapting, growing stronger, but the committee dismissed her concerns. The quarantine satellites were more than capable of containing a primitive species. The humans could play with their scavenged scraps all they wanted. They would never be a real threat. That was 10 years ago. Now stood in her private chambers on the conquered station, watching the latest intelligence reports scroll across her display, and she felt something she had not felt in 400 years of diplomatic service. She felt afraid. The humans had built a fleet, not a collection of rickety exploration vessels, but an actual military fleet. 47 warships, assembled in secret in the shadow of Neptune. They were ugly things, cobbled together from salvaged debris and human ingenuity. Their hulls were patched with different colors of alien metal. Their weapons were crude magnetic accelerators and jury-rigged plasma systems. Their engines were held together with welds and prayers. But they worked, somehow impossibly they worked. Had read the psychological profiles of the human commanders. She had studied their communications, their planning documents, their speeches to their crews, and she had found something that chilled her to her crystalline core. The humans were not building this fleet because they wanted to explore the galaxy. They were not building it because they wanted to trade or communicate or make friends. They were building it because they were angry. 200 years of isolation, 200 years of being ignored, 200 years of watching alien ships dump garbage in their backyard while automated weapons kept them trapped in their own solar system. The humans had taken all of that anger and focused it into something dangerous, something that no behavioral model had predicted. They had built weapons from scrap metal in spite, and now they were coming. Reached for her communication terminal. She needed to warn the council. She needed to request military reinforcements. She needed to make them understand that the quarantine had failed, that the embargo had only made things worse, that they had created the very threat they had tried to prevent. But even as she composed her message, she knew it was probably too late. The humans had spent 2 centuries learning patience. They had spent 2 centuries building their strength in secret. They were not going to wait any longer. The war, she realized, had already begun. Captain stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched her fleet move into formation. 47 ships, each one a monument to human stubbornness. They had names like Grudge and Reckoning and Never Again. They were crewed by volunteers who had trained for years in secret, who had learned to fight in simulators built from alien navigation systems, who had sworn oaths to break the cage that the galaxy had built around their home. Was 53 years old. She had spent her entire adult life preparing for this moment. Her grandfather had been on the first expedition to the debris fields, one of the 4 who did not come back. Her mother had been an engineer on the team that cracked alien superconductors. Her father had died testing the first prototype plasma weapon, vaporized when the containment field failed. 3 generations of her family had given everything to reach this point, and now she was going to finish what they started. The tactical display showed the quarantine satellites repositioning. The automated systems had finally noticed the fleet, and they were moving to intercept. Hundreds of defense platforms, each one armed with weapons that could vaporize a human ship in seconds. By every logical calculation, the Defiance and her sister ships should have had no chance. But the humans had not survived 2 centuries of imprisonment by being logical. They had survived by being stubborn, by being creative, by refusing to accept that the universe had decided they were not worthy of the stars. They had taken the galaxy's garbage and turned it into weapons. They had taken their anger and turned it into fuel. The first satellite opened fire. A beam of concentrated energy lanced across the void, aimed directly at the lead ship in the human formation. But the Grudge was already moving, its engines burning with scavenged alien fuel, its hull rotating to present its thickest armor. The beam struck a glancing blow, melting a section of hull plating that had once been part of a cargo container. The Grudge fired back. Its magnetic accelerators hurled chunks of sharpened debris at relativistic speeds, each projectile a piece of the same garbage that had been dumped in human space for 50 years. The satellite's shields flared, designed to stop energy weapons and plasma bolts, not physical objects traveling at a fraction of the speed of light. The debris punched through. The satellite exploded. A cheer went up across the fleet's communication channels. The first kill, the first proof that they could fight back, allowed herself a small smile, then keyed her microphone. "Maintain formation," she ordered. "That was just the first one. There are hundreds more." Doctor stood in the weapons bay of the Defiance, monitoring the plasma containment systems with the focus of a man who knew exactly how many ways they could fail. He was 71 years old, and he had spent more than half his life studying the exotic materials that the aliens had so carelessly thrown away. He understood them better than anyone else alive. He also understood that understanding was not the same as control. The plasma weapons were his greatest achievement and his greatest fear. They worked on principles that human physics could barely explain, using containment fields derived from alien industrial equipment and fuel synthesized from debris that should have been impossible to process. Every time one fired, there was a small chance it would simply explode instead. Had calculated the odds at roughly 1 in 50. He had not shared this calculation with the weapons crews. Another satellite fell, then another. The human fleet pushed forward, taking damage but refusing to stop. Ships vented atmosphere and lost crew members and kept fighting. The Reckoning took a direct hit that killed half its bridge officers, and the survivors simply promoted the next person in line and continued the attack. The Conquered had built its quarantine assuming that any species intelligent enough to reach the stars would also be intelligent enough to recognize when they were beaten. They had not accounted for the possibility of a species that simply refused to accept defeat. Watched the battle unfold and made her calculations. They were taking losses, but not as many as she had feared. The satellites were powerful, but they were also predictable. They had been programmed to deal with rational threats, ships that would retreat when damaged, fleets that would surrender when outmatched. They had no protocol for an enemy that simply kept coming. 3 hours into the battle, the last quarantine satellite went dark. The path to the inner system was clear. For 200 years, humanity had been trapped. For 200 years, they had watched the stars and known they would never reach them. For 200 years, they had raged against a cage they could not break. Now the cage was broken, and humanity was free. Opened a channel to the entire fleet. All ships, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Form up on the Defiance. We have a message to deliver. The message was simple. It was broadcast on every frequency the humans had been able to identify from their study of alien communications. It went out to the debris fields, to the cargo ships, to the distant stations that had spent 2 centuries pretending humanity did not exist. The quarantine is over, the message said. We're coming out. We suggest you start talking. Ambassador received the message in her private chambers. She read it 3 times, each time hoping she had somehow misunderstood. But the words were clear. The humans had broken through. The satellites were destroyed. The embargo had failed. She had warned them all, but no one had listened, and now it was too late. She began composing an urgent request for military intervention. The conquered would respond. They would send their best ships, their most advanced weapons, their most experienced commanders. They would crush this primitive rebellion before it could spread. But even as she wrote, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a question she could not answer. The humans had built a fleet from garbage. They had destroyed 200 years of containment infrastructure in a single day. They had done the impossible, simply because someone had told them they could not. What else might they be capable of? Did not know, and for the first time in her very long life, she was not certain she wanted to find out. The Conquered's first response fleet arrived in the Sol system 3 days after the quarantine satellites fell. Admiral, or commanded from the Bridge of the Eternal Judgment, a warship that had seen 100 campaigns and never known defeat. His fleet consisted of 24 vessels, each one representing the pinnacle of galactic military technology. Their weapons could crack planets. Their shields could withstand nuclear bombardment. Their crews had trained for decades in the finest military academies the Conquered had to offer. Or was a species of massive reptilian beings who had conquered their own star system through sheer force of will. He had no patience for diplomacy, no interest in negotiation, and no respect for primitive species who thought they could challenge the established order. The humans had destroyed some automated satellites. That was annoying. Now he would teach them what happened to species that annoyed the Conquered. The human fleet was waiting for him near Jupiter. 47 ships, battered and from their battle with the quarantine system. They looked pathetic compared to his gleaming warships. Their hulls were patched with mismatched metal. Their weapons were crude and obviously improvised. Several of them were venting atmosphere from damage they had not yet had time to repair. Or opened a communication channel. "This is Admiral Orr of the Galactic Conquered," he announced. "You will stand down immediately and surrender your vessels for inspection. Any resistance will be met with overwhelming force." There was a long pause. Then a human voice responded. A female, or noted, based on the vocal patterns his translator identified. "This is Captain of the United Earth Expeditionary Force," the voice said. "We acknowledge your presence in our solar system. We have no wish for conflict, but we will not surrender. We will not stand down, and we will not be caged again." Or made a sound that his species used to express contempt. "You have no choice," he replied. "Your ships are primitive. Your weapons are toys. You have no shields, no advanced targeting systems, no hope of victory. Surrender now and I will recommend mercy. Resist and I will destroy you all." Another pause. Then the human spoke again. "Admiral, do you know what your people have been doing to our system for the past 50 years? Or did not understand the question. He knew about the debris dumping, of course. It was common knowledge in conquered space, but he failed to see its relevance. You have been throwing your garbage at us, the human continued. For 50 years, your corporations have been using our home as a trash dump. We watched your ships arrive month after month. We collected your waste. We studied it. We learned from it. And now we have built weapons from the things you threw away. The Admiral's contempt deepened. You built weapons from garbage, he said. How impressive. We did, the human agreed. And do you know what we learned? We learned that your shields are designed to stop energy weapons, plasma bolts, laser beams, particle streams. They are very good at stopping those things. Or weighted. They are not very good, the human said, at stopping rocks. The human fleet opened fire. Or's tactical officers had prepared for plasma weapons. They had prepared for magnetic accelerators firing metal projectiles. They had even prepared for nuclear missiles, just in case the humans were desperate enough to use them. What they had not prepared for was what the humans actually launched. The projectiles were irregular in shape, tumbling end over end as they crossed the void. They were made of compressed debris, chunks of alien technology fused together into solid masses and fired at velocities that should have been impossible for such crude launchers to achieve. They were not elegant. They were not precise, but there were hundreds of them and they were very, very fast. The first wave struck the Eternal Judgment shields. The energy barriers flared, absorbing the impacts, just as Or had expected. But the debris did not vaporize like energy weapons would. It fragmented instead, breaking into thousands of smaller pieces that continued forward, each one carrying a fraction of the original momentum. The shield generators had not been designed for this kind of sustained physical assault. They began to overheat. Warning alarms sounded across the bridge. Or ordered his fleet to return fire. The conquered warships unleashed their weapons, beams of focused energy that could melt through asteroid rock. But the human ships were moving, scattering in patterns that made targeting difficult. Their movements were chaotic, unpredictable, nothing like the organized formations that conquered tactical doctrine expected. The humans were not fighting like a military fleet. They were fighting like a swarm of angry insects, each ship making its own decisions, following its own instincts. There was no central coordination to disrupt, no flagship to target, no command structure to decapitate. And they kept firing those damned rocks. The shield generators on the Eternal Judgment failed after 15 minutes of continuous bombardment. The warship's hull was the strongest material known to conquered science, capable of withstanding impacts that would shatter lesser vessels. But the humans had studied that material. They had found samples of it in the debris fields. They had learned its weaknesses. The next wave of projectiles struck the hull directly. They were not random chunks of compressed garbage anymore. They were shaped, sharpened, designed to concentrate their impact on the smallest possible area. They punched through the Eternal Judgment's armor like needles through cloth. Or felt his ship shudder as atmosphere began venting from a dozen breaches. Damage reports flooded in from every section. The humans were not trying to destroy his vessel, he realized. They were trying to cripple it. Targeting engines, weapons systems, sensor arrays. Precision strikes that should have been impossible with such primitive technology. But the humans had spent 200 years studying their enemy. They had learned everything they could from the garbage that had been dumped in their system. They knew how conquered ships were built. They knew where the weak points were. And they were very, very angry. 4 hours later, the first response fleet was no longer a coherent fighting force. 8 ships had been disabled, their engines destroyed and their weapons offline. 3 more had been forced to retreat, their captains wisely choosing survival over pride. The remaining vessels were scattered across the system, some still fighting, others simply trying to escape. The Eternal Judgment drifted in space, its proud hull by hundreds of impacts, or sat in his command chair, staring at the tactical display, trying to understand what had happened. His fleet had been beaten by primitive apes throwing rocks. It was impossible. It was humiliating. It was also, he was beginning to realize, entirely his own fault. The communication system crackled. Admiral, or the human voice said, "Your fleet is disabled. Your weapons are offline. Your shields are gone. Do you wish to continue fighting, or would you like to discuss terms?" Or's pride screamed at him to keep fighting, to order his remaining ships into a suicidal charge, to die with honor rather than surrender to primitives. But his duty was to the conquered, and the conquered needed to know what had happened here. "State your terms," he growled. The human paused. "We want to talk," she said. "That's all. We want the quarantine lifted. We want recognition as a spacefaring species. We want the dumping stopped. And we want an apology." An apology, Or repeated, not quite believing what he was hearing. "Your people kept us trapped in our own system for 200 years, the human said. They treated us like animals. They threw their garbage at us and assumed we would never be able to do anything about it. So yes, Admiral, we want an apology, a formal, public acknowledgement that the quarantine was wrong." Or was silent for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "You have destroyed my fleet," he said. "You have humiliated the greatest military power in the galaxy, and your demand is an apology." "We are not trying to prove we are dangerous," the human replied. "You already knew that. That's why you locked us up in the first place. We are trying to prove we are worth talking to." Or did not respond immediately. He was thinking about what he would say in his report, about how he would explain to the council that a species of primitive apes had defeated his fleet using weapons made from garbage, about how the quarantine that was supposed to protect the galaxy had instead created the very threat it was meant to prevent. The humans had been watching, he realized. For 200 years, they had been watching and learning and planning. They had taken the galaxy's contempt and transformed it into motivation. They had taken the galaxy's trash and transformed it into weapons. And now they were asking for nothing more than the chance to be heard. "I will relay your terms to the council," Or said finally. "I make no promises." "That's all we ask," the human replied. "Thank you, Admiral." The channel closed. Or sat in the darkness of his crippled bridge, surrounded by the wreckage of his certainty, and wondered what else the humans might be capable of if the council refused. He suspected he did not want to find out. Ambassador stood before the grand chamber of the Galactic Conquered, surrounded by representatives of 1,000 species, and delivered the most difficult report of her career. 3 response fleets had been sent to the Sol system. 3 response fleets had been defeated. Not destroyed, she emphasized. Disabled. The humans had been careful to minimize casualties, to cripple rather than kill. That restraint was what frightened her most. "The humans are not seeking conquest," she explained to the assembled delegates. "They are seeking recognition. They want to be treated as equals. They want the quarantine lifted and the dumping stopped. They want a formal apology for 2 centuries of isolation." The chamber erupted in chaos. 1,000 voices speaking at once, some demanding military intervention, others calling for negotiation, still others insisting that the whole situation was someone else's problem, waited for the noise to subside. "I have read the psychological profiles," she continued. "I have studied their communications. I have analyzed their tactics. The humans are not irrational. They are not mindlessly aggressive. They are simply a species that refuses to accept limitations imposed upon them without their consent." The delegate rose to speak. "They defeated Admiral," or he said, his voice thick with barely controlled rage. "They destroyed the pride of our fleet. This cannot go unanswered." Turned to face him. Admiral Or was defeated, she agreed, but his fleet was not destroyed. His crews are alive, his ships can be repaired. The humans could have killed them all, they chose not to. "Because they are weak," the delegate spat. "Because they are strategic," corrected. "They are demonstrating that they can hurt us without being monsters. They are proving that they are capable of restraint. Every ship they disable without destroying, every life they spare, sends the same message. We are not your enemies. We just want to be heard. The chamber fell silent, pressed on. We created this problem, she said. We quarantined their system without their knowledge or consent. We dumped our waste in their space because we assumed they would never be able to reach it. We treated them like animals, and we are shocked that they resented it. But they are not animals. They are intelligent beings with the same rights as any other species in this chamber. She paused, looking around at the assembled delegates. The humans are asking for something very simple, she said. They are asking for the chance to prove themselves. They are asking for a seat at this table. I recommend we give it to them. The debate continued for 3 more hours. Threats were made. Alliances were invoked. Ancient treaties were cited and disputed and reinterpreted. But in the end, the vote was unanimous. The quarantine would be lifted. The dumping would stop. The humans would receive formal recognition as a spacefaring species. The apology was harder. Pride was a powerful thing, especially for species that had spent thinking of themselves as superior, but had prepared for that as well. She had compiled a record of every violation of conquered law that had occurred during the quarantine, the unauthorized dumping, the failure to respond to human communications, the use of military force against a species that had committed no crimes. By the time she finished, even the most stubborn delegates understood that an apology was the minimum requirement to save face. Captain received the official communication 3 days later. She read it in her quarters aboard the Defiance, surrounded by the accumulated mementos of a lifetime of preparation, photographs of her grandfather, engineering diagrams drawn by her mother, the singed patch from her father's uniform recovered from the testing site where he had died. The Galactic Concord acknowledges its errors, the message read. The quarantine of the Sol system was implemented without proper consultation. The dumping of industrial waste violated established protocols. The military response was excessive and unwarranted. We extend our formal apology to the people of Earth and invite them to take their place among the spacefaring civilizations of the galaxy. Read it 3 times, then she cried. She cried for her grandfather, who had died reaching for the stars. She cried for her mother, who had spent her life unlocking alien secrets. She cried for her father, who had given everything to build the weapons that had finally broken the cage. And she cried for herself, for 53 years of training and planning and hopping, for all the nights she had stared at the sky and wondered if she would ever reach it, for the weight of 3 generations of sacrifice that had finally been justified. When she was finished, she wiped her eyes and composed her response. "The people of Earth accept your apology," she wrote. "We look forward to taking our place in the galactic community. We hope that our relationship will be built on mutual respect and understanding." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "And we hope," she added, "that you will never again underestimate what humans can build when you tell them they cannot." The message was transmitted, the war was over, and humanity at long last was free. Ambassador received response in her private chambers. She read it slowly, lingering on the final sentence. "What humans can build when you tell them they cannot." She thought about that for a long time. The humans had built a fleet from garbage. They had built weapons from debris. They had built a revolution from spite and determination and an absolute refusal to accept their fate. What else might they build now that the cage was broken? What wonders might they create now that they had access to the full resources of the galaxy? Did not know, but for the first time in this whole terrible affair, she found herself looking forward to finding out. The cosmic arms embargo had failed, but perhaps, she thought, that failure was exactly what the galaxy needed.